Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent. Dr. Norman Swan is one of Australia's most trusted media commentators in health and science. Born in Scotland, he migrated to Australia as a young man and has since built an illustrious career as a physician, journalist and broadcaster. Dr. Swan is best known for his long-running work with the ABC, including as the host of the Health Report on Radio National and a key voice during the COVID-19 pandemic through his immensely popular Coronacast podcast. A multi-award-winning journalist and author, Dr. Swan has dedicated his career to making complex medical issues accessible and relatable to the public. Today, we delve into a more personal side of his story, his journey as a migrant, and how it has shaped his identity, career, and connection to Australia. Dr. Swan, it's an absolute privilege to have you on.
Thanks very much.
Now, before we do get to your personal migration story, which I'm really interested in, of course, I do want to start by talking about your new book that was released earlier this year. So you want to know what's good for your kids. Can you give our audience a high-level summary of your book, please?
Yeah, sort of all 493 pages of it in 5 seconds. So look, I'll double back a little bit. One is I think that it's never been harder to be a parent in today's world. So many influences on you, the social media. You know, in the old days, our parents just had maybe 4 television channels, a few magazines, and the most annoying people to them were their parents giving them free advice or their aunt and uncle. Now it's the number of people giving you advice and the places you're going to for advice are huge, and you don't know what to believe. So this was the highest level view of the book is I've gone through the evidence for you. I've consulted with some of the world leading experts in the area of parenting and child development. I've given you the references. So here's information that you can rely on from birth to the age of 10. And it's significant as to birth to the age of 10 because there are plenty books on early childhood, but there's almost nothing on the 5 to 10 age group. These are called the middle years, but they used to be called the salad years because doctors and others used to say, oh, don't worry about that. When your kid turns 5, these are the dream years before the dark clouds of adolescence fall on your family. Don't worry about it. And what people I'm not getting to worry about it, but people realize that an awful lot is going on during those years, those middle years. They're the runway to adolescence, and they're the runway to the rest of your life, and really important elements there. And so I talk about that changing landscape and how it affects you as a parent and how you can parent most effectively during that time.
So what matters most then to raising kids in those so-called middle years?
Things don't change, although the way you do it might change. So there are a few rules that I've put into the book that you need to follow but adapt. So, and before I go on, one of the problems with parenting books is they generalize, and they, as if you can adapt everything you're going to say to every child. And what I say again and again in the book is parenting is a game of tennis. You serve to your child, they return. Then you return on that. And so if you have a volley going. And some children, you serve to them, they will give you a top spin back and you're running to the edge of the court to save the ball. And then they give you another spin back and you're running off to the other side, and absolutely exhausted. Whereas other children will just straight back. Every child is different. And how you play that child, play is not the right word, but you know what I mean. How you parent that child is different. There's a one-to-one relationship. And so you've got to there are big rules, but you've got to adapt them to each child's situation because you're a different parent with each child. And what I talk about in the book is how your child is born with a certain temperament, and that temperament tends to last for that child, the rest of that child's life. And remember, you're going to be that child's parent when you're 90 and they're 70. And they might want to treat you like they're your parent when you're 90 and they're 70, but you're still their mom or dad.
Sure.
And so there are certain rules here apart from that individualization. And I describe several kind of spectra, certain graded lines, lines of parenting style. And the bottom one is a line that goes from warm to cold. So cold is a parent who has find trouble expressing emotion to the child, being emotionally available to the child. That's at the extreme end. It's a constant variable in, and then warm is you're all over them, you cuddle them, they know that you love them, you tell them all the time, and so on. And you think, well, I can kind of see what's not good about cold. That's not great. But what possibly could be bad about warmth? Then you've got to go up to the next line, which is a line that's about expectations of your child, boundary setting, where they know where you stand, what you expect of them. Old fashioned stuff, but in fact, it works. Now, by the way, I'm not plucking this out of thin air. This stuff comes from a lot of research and following large numbers of parents, their children, and the children's children, particularly in Australia. We've got some very large studies that are already into third generation. We know a lot about parenting style. So if we come to that boundary setting one, if you are cold and a harsh disciplinarian and you give your child no latitude, that's not associated with great outcomes. It tends to be a child who rebels, can be involved in drug use, can have mental health issues, and so on. That's not great. At the extreme end of warmth, where you believe, and coming onto the boundary setting one, where you believe, well, I don't want to set boundaries. I want my child to learn for themselves, to experience life. They'll grow up better if they've learned their lessons for themselves, and you let them do that. That's called indulgent parenting. It might not feel like indulgent parenting, but it's indulgent parenting because there's no boundaries or too few boundaries, no expectations. And the child actually doesn't learn a lot of autonomy in that, and also tends to be overprotected, and they end up being entitled. That's what the research suggests. That child ends up being entitled, ends up not fulfilling their promise academically, not finishing off degrees. When they go into a new job, they know better than everybody else after a week how to do the job, and everybody else is an idiot and they don't get probation. That's the sort of child, sweeping generalization, we get with super indulgent parenting. So where you're at is somewhere in not really in the middle, but you're a parent who loves your child. They know you love your child. You're warm to your child, but you set boundaries. The child knows what's expected of them, and that's not that they're going to become a plastic surgeon or an astrophysicist. It's that you're going to be a decent human being, whatever boundaries you wish to set, and that predicts your child is going to do well. And the other thing I talk about is they're always watching. Children watch you and watch how you behave and what you do. So if you're on the phone at the dinner table, answering your emails or checking Instagram, then you haven't got a hope in hell of controlling screen time with your children. If you fly off the handle when a cup drops off the table and breaks, then the child will learn that's what you do when something insignificant happens. What predicts a successful child's entry into school, which is coming to that 5-year gap, that 5 to 10-year age group, is a child who's got good emotional regulation, does not fly off the handle, does not have uncontrolled anger, can express their needs calmly, and get on with the other kids. That kid's going to do well, where compared to other kids going into school.
There's so much to unpack there. I'm interested in whether a child is born with temperament, or is that something that's sort of learned following birth, perhaps through observing the parents. But that's one thing that I'd like to pick your brains on. But another is about screen time. And you mentioned screen time there. And of course, screen time has absolutely skyrocketed in recent times. And you draw a distinction between screen use for education purposes and social purposes. in your book, and you recommend that parents should not allow screen use for social purposes until the age of about 13. Recently, of course, the Australian Parliament passed world first laws banning the use of social media for children under the age of 16. I'm wondering what you make of these new changes.
Well, let me answer the first question first, which is about temperament. I talk a lot in so you know what's good, so you want to know what's good for your kids about temperament and genes and inheritability. So each child, when they're born, is born with a certain kind of temperament. And I boil it down to really one element, which is how reactive your child is. And they're the same. You can go right back to the almost the day they were born, and they might be 20 now or they might be 10, and you can still see the elements of that. So the reactive child is one who's high in the reactive scale, is one who doesn't like being stimulated that much, is a bit awkward to they're never very cuddly, they don't like new things, they prefer their own company. I'm not describing pathology here. This is not pathology. This is just the range of normal human beings in the world. And then there are other kids who are more laid back and are really friendly and like other kids and don't need a lot of time by themselves and so on. And those things that style expresses itself in different ways and modifies as the child gets older. And the reactive child does not predict a child is going to become anxious. It's a slight increase in risk of anxiety, but not really. It's just that child's way of being in the world. And it tends to persist but express itself in different ways. So the child, when they become 4, is less, or 5, is less averse to new things in their life, but they still might like time by themselves and prefer their own company from time to time. So that's the temperament story. And that goes through and it changes through those first 10 years of life. Screens is a very complicated story. And I'm not as critical as I probably should have been in the book of schools. Schools have introduced screens for education, and I can't find very much, if any evidence for any evidence that screens improve educational outcomes. In fact, some schools are moving away from screens. And the terrible thing that's happened as a result of schools introducing screens is kids come home and say, well, what's the problem with my using a screen at home? I'm told to use it at school, and I've got to use my laptop, and the laptop's attached to the internet for an educational technique that's got Zippo evidence. Zippo evidence. So here's the thing about screens, and it starts early on, is that time spent on a screen does not teach the child real world skills. So you're deluding yourself as a parent if you think that you are turning your child into an Einstein by giving them a screen and they learn all sorts of things. They've done experiments. One very simple one, which is they give a young child, an iPad with a building block game, and they learn how to do the building blocks. Then they take away the screen and they give them identical building blocks, and they don't know what to do. They've got to start from scratch. They haven't learned a thing from the screen.
Mm.
So it's not easily transferable. And time spent on the screen is time not spent doing normal developmental activities outside, playing, interacting with other kids, interacting with the rest of the family, reading books, being read to. Those things are not happening. So you can get obsessed with social media and screens, but screen time themselves, particularly with access to mobile screens, is really problematic. So in North America, 90% of kids under 5 have an iPad or a tablet of some kind. And what they've shown is that use of an iPad at age 3 predicts poor emotional control and anger outbursts at age 4. And poor emotional control and anger outbursts at age 4 predicts iPad use at age 5. So iPads become pacifiers, but because they're not interacting with the world normally, they don't learn emotional regulation. So we can go on about the anxiety epidemic in younger kids and eating disorders, but if you talk to primary school teachers and early childhood educators, they'll tell you they have not seen the level of challenging behaviors that they've seen now. Now, that's not genetic. Genes haven't changed. They're the same children genetically, same parents genetically. What's changed is screen access and from our developmental pathway, regardless of what they're seeing on the screen almost. And then you've got to add the content. So if a young child is seeing content which has got fast editing in it, then that changes their brain and rewires their brain the way the networks, because there are two periods of plasticity in a child's life, of really big plasticity. First 2 years of life, and then when they get to about 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, there's a second period of plasticity. And the way the content, regardless of, it could be the most benign looking content and friendly content, but if it's quickly, there's sharp editing, that can change a child's brain. And then they get addicted. These technologies are designed to be addictive. You don't want to expose your child to nicotine or other drugs when they're young, but yet we're exposing them
Mm.
to other addictive substance, which is screens.
Dr. Swan, could there be any nexus between attention deficit disorders and the fast moving motions that you mentioned that kids are not uncommonly exposed to?
It's controversial, but some people believe there is a link. You've got to have a genetic susceptibility to develop ADHD. But some kids might travel through life with that genetic susceptibility and never develop ADHD
Mm.
because they might have only a mild dose of the gene, if you could understand that. But if they get a strong dose of the environmental trigger for ADHD, they might develop it in a world where they might not otherwise have done so. And screens
Mm.
may be doing that. So there is some evidence about attention
Mm.
span, impulsivity, and
Mm.
so on.
Now, the old saying, give me a child until he's 7 and I'll show you the man. I believe there's a few different extrapolations of that saying.
It's the Jesuit saying.
Is there any truth to that, or is that just wildly inaccurate?
No, childhood is where you get molded for the rest of your life. It's the runway to adulthood. You're when you're a parent of young kids, all you can do is take a deep breath, get over the fact that you haven't slept, and trudge through to the next little crisis. But actually, what you're doing is building an adult, and
Mm.
how that child's experiences can change that child's brain and the way they are in the world. Now, you don't want to panic about this. A lot of things are changeable. So there are three things that a child wants from you,
Mm.
and a lot can work around that. In addition to the style of parenting, it's predictability, consistency, and routine.
Mm.
Sounds old fashioned, but if they've got that, then those are the guardrails for a child's
Mm.
development. And then the experiences they get in between that can enrich.
Now, on parenting, in your book, you write that today's parents confront issues that other parents have never had to confront. The fact that everyone seems to be exceptionally time poor comes to mind. I mean, what are those broader, I guess, challenges, and why are our times so unique?
If you ask parents, if you do a survey of parents, they'll tell you their two biggest concerns are lack of time for their kids and financial worries. Those are their two big concerns. And you've got two parents working and they're worried about money and they're feeling guilty about time. Now, that's not an entirely new thing in human development. I mean, we think it's the first time in human development that this has ever occurred. Now, this happened when we were hunter gatherers.
Mm.
Those were not stress-free environments. So by and large, one group of people, usually the men, were out hunting and the women were out gathering, plants and so on for food. In other words, the whole thing was about food and gathering. But what was different, so they didn't have time and they had anxiety about resources. So that's not new. But what they
Mm.
did have was a coherent village or family group around them. So while they were out doing that, the grandparents brought up the child, or close relatives
Mm.
brought up the child. In Aboriginal communities today, people in Aboriginal communities today will talk about their aunties, and if you actually look
Mm.
at the relationship, the actual family relationship, they're not aunties, but they're aunties in the sense that they're carers within the community and people they identify as close regardless of genetic links.
Mm.
So that's always occurred. But what doesn't happen now is that not many people have the village around the child.
Mm.
So you've got the same worries that we've had throughout human evolution: time, money, and for money,
Mm.
resources. But and we've got grandparents who do a lot of childcare, but not every day of the week,
Mm.
not always available, not always in the same city. And you don't have this coherent village around you. Therefore, you're on your own and you're bombarded with all this crap information.
Sure. And unless it's a transient sort of state at the moment, it seems like it's almost like a structural societal issue. I'm not quite sure, but
Well, it is. We don't quibble at the age of 5 that
Mm,
every child in Australia has free access to primary school education. In fact, you've got to send your child to school, and it's irrespective of your ability to pay. We don't have that from early childhood. They're nibbling away at that in terms of subsidized early childhood
mm,
education, but there's a long, long way to go. Childcare centers put up their fees so that the net out of pocket of parents
mm,
is either the same or goes up. So we should have free. What's the difference? What suddenly happens at age 5 when we know that development is occurring acutely through those early years? So we should have free or highly subsidized childcare with no out of pocket early on, because we've created a society where the village has broken down
mm.
and the market has failed. And when the market has failed, that's when governments come in and either regulate or subsidize.
Dr. Swan, is it accurate to talk about a distinctive Western or perhaps Australian style of parenting, or would that be totally inaccurate?
I think it's probably inaccurate. People who've come, we're talking about migration today as well as parenting. And people come from societies and cultures from around the world. So, for example, if you are first generation, and you could well be that you experience, and you're the first, so in other words, your parents, you might have grown up for a few years in the home country and then come to Australia. You might have experienced much more disciplinarian parenting than you got in Australia. So when you come to Australia, your parents or your grandparents think that, Australians are really lax parents. They're not as tough as we were in the home country.
Mm,
And we know that Chinese parents are aghast at what they see in Anglo-Australian parenting. And I mean, I've got a great photograph, which is of my wife's niece, whose mother is Vietnamese,
mm.
and she's the same age as my granddaughter in Washington, and we've got parallel photographs of them in their high chairs eating, and the child of the Vietnamese Australian mother is sitting in the high chair with everything in place, not even needing to wear a bib, and eating. I can't remember what age she was, but it was probably only about a year
Mm.
old. And my granddaughter in the United States, her face is red with raspberry juice and her bib is covered in everything, the crap all over the high chair. And um, and so when we go to the United States, we think I'm not talking about
Mm.
I'm not talking about my grandkids, but you know, we tend to think, well, American parents are much laxer than we are in Australia, which may well be true. So I think it varies a lot, and it varies a lot within Australia. We've got such rich diversity.
That's a great segue into the other topics. But just lastly, where can our listeners get your book?
So you can get it from Amazon or any of the booksellers like Dimmocks and so on. So you can buy it online. Almost all of the bookshops have it, and and bookshops like Dimmocks always have a good supply.
Sounds like a great read. I'll definitely be onto that myself.
And
So,
it's a good one for grandparents. Grandparents are often frustrated. They're giving free childcare, but they're not allowed to say anything about how their kids are bringing up their grandkids, and been told what to do, and they're very frustrated. But it's also parents don't have time to read parenting books, but grandparents do. So I recommend it for grandparents, particularly for Christmas.
for all those grandparents out there, all right. Thank you. Now, Dr. Swan, to your personal migration journey, could you please tell us about your migration story? What brought you out from Scotland to Australia in 1978? And what was the transition like for you?
I feel like a fraud talking about my migration story because a lot of people listening to this podcast will have been refugees, they'll have experienced major trauma in their home country, they'll have experienced even more trauma here trying to be accepted into Australia as asylum seekers and so on. So, and and they're with a degree of desperation to come to Australia and either reconnect with family they already have and so on. So I had a lot of family in Australia who came out to Australia after World War II. And they're mostly in Melbourne, but a little bit in Sydney. So I had an emotional link to Australia through them. However, I had no intention of migrating to Australia. I was training in pediatrics in London, and just the way things had worked out, my timing for applying for a training scheme at Guy's Hospital in London, I just because of the way my jobs worked and so on, I just missed the boat in terms of the application date for that. So I had a year, which I could either spent in British hospitals, but I thought, why don't I go out to Australia? Because I've always had had this idea of Australia and get a decent job there and then reapply
Mm,
at the next level coming back for
mm,
training. So I applied for a job at it was Children's Hospital in Camperdown in New South Wales. Snow moved out to Westmead Hospital, Children's Hospital Westmead. And to my amazement, I got a registrar's job there, and I came out. And then when I was applying for a visa to come out, Australia House said, "Well, what kind of visa do you want?" And this is 1978. I said, "What do you need?" Because I was getting all sorts of trouble, which is what you get now. Then, oh, well, you can have whatever you want. You can have a temporary visa, you can have a working visa, or you can even have a permanent residence visa if you want. I almost fell off my chair. Well, I said, well, I've no idea what's going to happen. I'm intending to come back, but well, I might as well take the permanent residence visa, which gives me most flexibility. So I came on a permanent. I mean that was my trauma. I mean,
uh-huh,
it's almost insulting to people who've struggled day by day to be
mm,
accepted into
mm,
Australia and make that migration journey. I entered Australia for the first time with a permanent residence visa,
mm,
and I was only intending to stay for a year, and then I fell in love with
mm.
the place and stayed.
How different times were. How about the Australia of the early 80s and the late 70s? Was it a very different country back then in the sense that were there specific challenges that you faced during those early years in Australia? Just if you could describe the general environment in Australia back then.
Australia was it was very easy to misread Australia coming to it in those days. I think it's less true now because there's just been enormous migration of Vietnamese people into Australia, Chinese, Indians, people from the Indian subcontinent, and so on. And so what you see on the streets of Australia now is very different. I mean, there were parts of Sydney, and there still are parts of Sydney that are very white, but there are fewer and fewer of them. However, in those days, it looked just like it actually looked a bit like Scotland. The pubs looked the same, tiled, people drinking at lunchtime, betting going on. It felt very familiar, but
Mm,
it was a mistake to assume that it was actually a transplanted Little Britain, because even in those days, it wasn't. It was a very different country. And even in those days, it had a very rich level of diversity, which you never saw in Britain, which just changed the nature of the place. You had people who had really wanted to be in Australia, who wanted to be in Australia, were working very hard to become Australian and developing a very different Australian identity, which was much richer than anything I'd seen in Britain. Britain was just this
mm,
monoculture. Even though there are plenty of migrants in Britain, very different nature. There was
mm.
much more of a mixing pot in Australia, which made it exciting.
And was there ever a point where you thought to yourself, "Oh, look, that's it. I'm packing up my bags and I'm going back." Did you ever have that moment?
I realized I had opportunity here, which the social structures back in Britain, because I didn't have the right
Mm,
accent, hadn't been to the right university, would have precluded me from doing. And I had
mm,
opportunity here, which I wouldn't have had in Britain. So actually, at no point, in fact, at one point, I can't exactly when it was, it might have been in the early 90s. Yeah, it probably was in the early 90s. I actually got offered quite a big job back in London, not a medical job, it was a kind of semi government job. And
mm,
it took no effort of thought for me to say no.
mm.
Uh,
Well, you
say,
had clarity. Okay. Interesting. So let's go, I think, now to Glasgow and your childhood there. You describe yourself as having had a troubled upbringing.
the important thing to say here about my migration experiences,
Mhm.
I grew up as a child of migrants in Glasgow.
Mm,
Well, a sense child or at least a grandchild of migrants. So we were not a long-standing Scottish family. My grandparents had migrated as children, the only exception being my maternal great grandfather, who actually had come as an adult in the late 19th century. but the rest of them came either as young adults or children escaping pogroms in Russia. So there were Russian migrants, and that
Mm,
was within living memory that they were Russian migrants. And I was the grandchild of
mm,
Russian migrants. And so that migrant experience for me, paradoxically, is much
mm.
more acutely experienced from Britain than it was coming to Australia.
Very interesting. You weren't a stranger to that experience, even though you were born in Scotland. How vivid was that memory that you would have presumably been exposed to through your grandparents and perhaps parents? Was that quite vivid for you?
Absolutely. It was talked about, there were stories told, and they talked about family they'd left behind. And but the core narrative was they'd escaped persecution and probable death and
Mm,
found refuge in Britain. And so that was a dominant narrative growing up.
mm.
It wasn't a traumatic narrative, but it was a dominant narrative. But it's certainly triggering when you're living in Australia and people who are trying to find refuge here as asylum seekers, escaping the same sort of persecution, are actually persecuted and denied that access. Then that does tend to be triggering when you've been the beneficiary of a much more open door policy.
I guess it begs the question, what role do you think health systems play or should play with supporting migrants to adapt and thrive in their new countries?
Well, the first thing is we should just give access to Medicare much more liberally than we do. I mean, some people who come in have limited access to our healthcare system and affordability, and that's building up problems for the future. These are people who are almost certainly going to stay in Australia, and they're going to be productive citizens, and they may have illnesses, they may have psychological illnesses, but they may have physical illnesses that need to be dealt with and treated, and are not because they don't have access to good healthcare. Yes, there are refugee health services and so on, but it's not the same as everybody else. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that we have an under-resourced, inefficient mental health care system. So a lot of people coming into this country who actually firsthand, people who've experienced firsthand persecution may not have the support they need and require to get through. Now, some people might say, "Oh well, we welcomed Holocaust survivors into Australia," which is true. I think Australia's got per capita more Holocaust survivors or had than any other country in the world. And they would say, "Oh well, we didn't have mental health support." Well, I would argue it's probably maybe they should have had because there are a lot of traumatized people and traumatized children of Holocaust survivors. But they also had a very strong community. And so there's a lot that the community can provide in terms of support that the health system can't.
Mm,
And we've got to get that balance right. But there's got to be more action.
mm.
But the problem is we haven't got the mental health system, the demands on it.
Australia's multicultural society brings with it diverse relationships with health and well-being. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw challenges in raising awareness and ensuring compliance within certain community groups. What lessons do you think we can take from that experience to improve how we communicate and deliver public health messages to migrant and culturally diverse communities in the future?
In a country like Australia, with the diversity we've got, you can't assume that there's uniformity within the community. And you can't assume that telling people what to do because it's good for them will result in people changing their behavior. And with the complexity of people's backgrounds, their cultural and religious backgrounds, their social and familial networks, you've actually got to start with them, even though it's slower, and work out how to work with communities. Melbourne was a classic example. They told them what to do in the northwest corridor of Melbourne, didn't consult with communities, and it was a disaster. And it got close to being a disaster in New South Wales as well, and South by Sydney, until they started consulting communities, going out, finding community leaders who are willing to lead with, to lead, consult, and work out the best strategies. The strategy that's going to work with Anglo communities is not necessarily going to work with an Assyrian community or a Vietnamese community. You got to work out what will work best. So the thing about healthcare is that it needs to be rooted in communities.
Is there a distinct form of migrant resilience? Are migrants a bit more resilient than the rest of the populace?
I hate the word resilience because the word resilience, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about the ability to bounce back after adversity. And it implies that there are strong people who are resilient and weak people who are not resilient. And that's largely not the way it works. Resilience is a condition of the moment. You could have had a bad year or two. Let's remove the migrant experience 'cause from that. A parent could have died. You've lost your job. You've got trouble with your relationship. Your kids are
Mm,
going off the rails. Multiple traumas going on, and then something insignificant happens and you get just psychological distress, mental health issues, PTSD, whatever. And then because you've progressively weakened your ability to bounce back, and then a year or two later, it could be back. And it's a moment in time when you've just been progressively weakened by one thing after the other. And once that tends to recede into the background, you start to be able to bounce back after adversity. Now, there is something else going on with migrants, and it's called the healthy migrant. Well, it's got various names, but it's the healthy migrant phenomenon. People who migrate, by and large, are healthier than the people they left behind. So they've done studies, for example, of Greek islanders who moved to Melbourne and then compared them to their close relatives back on the island they came from. One of them was Lefkada. And Greek migrants to Melbourne from Okada are much healthier than the
mm,
people they left behind. Because the healthier people tend to be the ones who get up and go and migrate. They're different people from the ones left behind. But also the ones left behind, after World War II, when you're talking about the older Greek migrants, there was incredible poverty on the Greek islands. So they lived through a lot of poverty, relative malnutrition. You go on, as I do too, about the Greek island diet and how healthy it is. Well, it
mm,
wasn't that healthy, let me tell you, after the war, because they had very poor nutrition. Whereas they came to Australia and they had great nutrition. And that combination of the Australian diet would, then we came back to the Greek island diet
mm.
in a country of plenty. But the core answer to your question is migrants are different from people who don't migrate.
Mm. There seems to be a disproportionate, call it success rate, amongst migrants and some sort of a drive which often transpires to entrepreneurial sort of spirit, etc. What could be the reason for that, do you think?
There's all sorts of stories, and I think it's also partly the environment and the culture from which they came. And if you come from Vietnam, communist country, but nonetheless encouraged small scale enterprise, and you had to have it to survive, then you've grown up around you with it's not genetic. It's just you've grown up around you with that thing that I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to work all day, and I'm going to make money. And education is really important for my kids, et cetera, et cetera. People from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh have a kind of similar ethic as many European migrants do. There are some, and I just don't know how much of this is prejudice. They say there are some countries of origin where they've been less successful, or it's been generational,
Mm,
where a group of people, maybe from one particular country, might have come at the turn of the 19th, 20th century and were incredibly successful writers, industrialists, lawyers, doctors, and so on. I mean, somehow coming from the same environment 60, 70, 80 years later, they've been less successful, which may well simply due to strife and trouble in that
mm,
environment and the loss of that. If you've got mass migration of your entrepreneurs, then who's left
mm.
behind in a sense?
Sure.
It's
It's
incredibly,
like the brain drain.
yeah, it's an incredibly complicated story to do that. But there is this sense that what the heck? I've got nothing to lose here, everything to gain. I'm in this
Mm,
great country. I want my kids to make it, and I'll work day and night. And the kids see me working day and night, and the kids will do that
mm,
too.
mm. Have a go, as it's said. On a final note, then, Dr. Swan, if you could share one piece of advice with newly arrived migrants, what would that be?
Don't make assumptions. Keep your mind open, and watch, observe, learn, and edge into your place in this new community rather than jumping to too many conclusions too early.
Dr. Swan, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.